The moving truck arrived just before dusk. The air was heavy with that autumn stillness that made every sound, gravel crunching, hinges squealing, feel amplified and unnatural. Emma and her husband, David, stood at the edge of the cracked driveway, staring at the house they had bought online for half its listed value. 2 stories, faded blue paint, ivy climbing the brick, and windows that seemed to reflect more shadow than light. To Emma, it looked like something that had been waiting, not abandoned, but expectant. David laughed it off, calling it character. Still, as she stepped across the threshold, she felt a pulse of cold air brush her face, as if the house had exhaled for the first time in years. The first few days were uneventful, filled with unpacking and renovations. But there was something off about the walls. Every nail they hammered seemed to strike hollow space, as though the house wasn't solid inside. At night, Emma began hearing soft dragging noises between the walls, like someone crawling through insulation. David said it was just old pipes, but Emma noticed the cat, a stray that had followed them to the house, never ventured past the living room. One morning, she found the cat sitting at the top of the stairs, its fur raised, staring at the attic door. The handle was shaking, ever so slightly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. By the 4th night, sleep became impossible. The dragging had turned into whispering. Emma swore she heard her name. Emma, come see, whispered in a hoarse voice that seemed to crawl beneath her pillow. When she asked David if he heard it, he said nothing, only stared blankly at the ceiling as if listening to something she couldn't. The next morning, she found him in the basement, surrounded by old photographs of strangers she'd never seen. None of them were smiling. When she asked where he found them, he said, they were already here. The house wants them out. Emma decided she would leave. That evening, while David was outside burning boxes, she packed a small bag and went upstairs for her phone. But when she reached the landing, she froze. The attic door was wide open. A rope hung down from the opening, swaying gently. From inside came the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the edge. She called out David's name, but the voice that answered wasn't his, it was her own, distorted, echoing from the darkness above. Why are you leaving? Then, a face, hers again, pale and expressionless, appeared in the shadows, staring down. She screamed and ran outside, but the world looked wrong, darker, like the street lamps had gone out and the air had thickened. David was nowhere to be found. Only the house stood before her, its windows glowing with faint orange light, as if alive from within. When she turned to run down the road, her feet sank slightly into the dirt, and she realized the driveway was gone, replaced by tall grass and crooked trees. The house had moved, or maybe she had. Either way, the house on Ashridge Lane was no longer part of any map. 3 months later, the house on Ashridge Lane was back on the market. The realtor, Gail Turner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, stood outside the property with a clipboard in hand and a pair of gloves tucked into her coat pocket. She hated dealing with abandoned listings, but this one came with a lucrative commission. The couple who'd bought it, the Carvers, had vanished without a trace. Their car was found parked by the back fence, doors open, keys still in the ignition. No sign of struggle, no fingerprints, nothing. Gail had handled hundreds of properties in her career, but something about this house unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. It felt like the walls were leaning in, listening. She unlocked the front door, and the smell hit her, not decay, not dust, but something damp and earthy, like the inside of an old grave. The air was heavy, clinging to her clothes. She called out the usual greeting just to hear her own voice echo, realtor entering. Her footsteps creaked against the warped floorboards as she moved through the rooms. Boxes still sat half unpacked, dishes in the sink, a coffee cup on the counter. It looked like the Carvers had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their lives. She made a note to remove personal items before showing the house, but her pen faltered when she noticed the cup was still warm. As she climbed the stairs to photograph the second floor, Gail noticed faint handprints smeared along the wallpaper. They were the size of a woman's hands, but pressed too deep, as though they had sunk into the surface. At the top of the landing, she stopped. The attic door was open again. The pull-down ladder hung crooked, swaying slightly even though there was no draft. From above, a low hum filled the air, rhythmic, steady, almost mechanical. Gail lifted her phone to take a video, but the screen flickered and went black. Then the whispering began. It came from inside the walls, not words but voices overlapping, like a crowd murmuring from behind plaster, heart pounding. She reached for the attic rope, intending to close it and leave, but the ladder shifted on its own, slowly descending, each hinge creaking in succession. A chill moved through her as she saw what lay above, a small light, flickering like a candle, and beyond it, a figure kneeling. She could only see its back, hunched and trembling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. The figure turned its head slightly, and though it moved in slow motion, Gail's stomach dropped. It was a woman. Same hair color as the photo of Emma Carver she had seen in the case file. But her face was gray, eyes black and wide like two empty sockets. Gail stumbled back, her heel catching on a loose board. The attic light went out instantly, plunging the hallway into darkness. She fled down the stairs, tripping over her bag, slamming through the front door into the cold evening air. As she gasped for breath, she looked up one last time, and there, in every window, she saw someone watching. Not just Emma. Dozens of faces, all gray and silent, pressed against the glass as if waiting to be let out. The next morning, the house appeared empty again, every window clean, every box gone. But Gail's car was still in the driveway, keys in the ignition, engine cold. The Jacobs family found the listing by accident. A cozy 3-bedroom colonial on the outskirts of town, freshly renovated, reasonably priced, and previously owned by the same family for generations. It seemed too good to be true, but after years of renting small apartments, Emily Jacobs was determined to finally give her daughter, Sophie, a real home. Her husband, Mark, wasn't thrilled about the isolation. The house stood alone at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by acres of dense woodland, but he trusted his wife's instinct. They moved in on a mild spring afternoon, the air sweet with lilac, the sound of distant birds echoing between the trees. Everything felt peaceful. Almost rehearsed, from the start. Sophie loved the house. The first thing she said when they walked in was, "It feels like someone's waiting for me." Emily laughed nervously, assuming her daughter meant it in the way children sometimes sense warmth. But later that night, when she tucked Sophie into bed, she found her whispering softly into the wall. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Sophie smiled sleepily and said, "The lady upstairs. She said her name is Emma." The words froze Emily in place. She didn't know anyone named Emma, but for a reason she couldn't explain, the name made her stomach twist. Over the next week, little things began to happen. Knocking sounds inside the walls, slow and rhythmic, like someone trapped behind the plaster. Shadows sliding across the hallways even when all the lights were on. And the faint smell of damp earth, the same one that lingered even after cleaning. Mark brushed it off as new house quirks, but one night he came downstairs to find every cabinet door open and the kitchen floor covered in muddy footprints. They led to the back door, which was locked from the inside. The next morning, they found Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator, a blue house surrounded by dark trees. In every window, there were faces, gray, blurred, and identical. When the noises grew louder, Emily decided to check the attic. She climbed the creaking ladder, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams groaned under her weight. At first, nothing seemed out of place, old boxes, cobwebs, and insulation. But then she noticed the far wall. It looked freshly painted. As she moved closer, she realized it wasn't paint, it was plaster. Someone had sealed off a portion of the attic, smoothing it perfectly to hide what was behind. And carved faintly into the surface were words, written by a shaking hand, "She found me here. Don't open it." That night, the whispering began again, clearer this time, coming from inside the attic itself. Emily froze as she heard Sophie's voice echo down the stairs. "Mommy, she says we live in her house now." When Emily rushed into her daughter's room, the girl was standing by the wall, her small hand pressed flat against it, as if feeling for a pulse. "She wants to show me her real face," Sophie said, smiling faintly. Behind her, in the wallpaper's faint reflection, another face was watching, pale, gray, and wet with soil. Emily didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind pressed into her nerves like nails. Mark had gone into town to stay overnight for work, leaving her and Sophie alone in the house. She tried to convince herself it was normal, that the whispering was just plumbing, the smell was mold, and the voices were her imagination. But by midnight, she could no longer pretend. The whispers weren't random anymore. They were calling her name. "Emily, come upstairs," the same voice her daughter had described. When she opened Sophie's door, the bed was empty, the sheets tossed aside, and a trail of small footprints led toward the attic. Heart hammering, Emily climbed the ladder. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. The flashlight flickered, catching on dust motes that floated like ash. "Sophie," she whispered. The attic was silent, except for a faint tapping behind the sealed wall. She stepped closer, her shaking fingers grazing the plaster where the words, "Don't open it," were carved. Beneath her touch, she felt vibration, a slow heartbeat. Then she heard it, a child's laughter, muffled but near. Her instincts screamed to run, but the laughter turned into a cry, small and terrified. It sounded like Sophie. Against every ounce of reason, Emily grabbed a crowbar and began to dig into the wall. It took only seconds before the plaster cracked open. A rush of air, damp, cold, foul, poured into the attic. Inside was a narrow space, no more than a few feet wide. She shone the flashlight in, expecting to see her daughter, but what she saw instead stopped her breath. Dolls, dozens of them, lined neatly on wooden shelves, their faces smeared with dirt, their eyes all blacked out. In the center, hanging from a nail, was a small music box. It was playing a soft, broken tune. Beneath it lay an old photograph of a woman, Emma Carver, and beside her, a child that looked exactly like Sophie. The faces had been scratched out, but the resemblance was undeniable. Suddenly, the flashlight went out. The music stopped. In the silence, a whisper slid against her ear, "She's mine now." Emily turned, but the attic was pitch black. Something moved, slow, deliberate, circling her. Then came the sound of fingernails scraping the floorboards, close enough that she could hear the skin tearing. She swung the flashlight wildly, and for an instant, she saw her daughter standing near the hatch, smiling, but her eyes were completely black, and her lips were moving in sync with the whispering. "Don't worry, Mommy," Sophie said softly. "I'm not alone anymore." Emily lunged forward, but her foot broke through the old boards. She fell, crashing through the ceiling into the hallway below. Pain shot through her leg as she looked up. Sophie's face peered through the broken planks, still smiling. And just before Emily blacked out, she saw another face beside her daughter, Emma's, eyes hollow, mouth open wide, whispering, "You opened the wall. Now we can all come home." Emily woke in a hospital bed 2 days later. Her leg was wrapped, her body bruised, but her mind, that was where the real damage lived. The police said she was found unconscious in her hallway by a mail carrier who noticed the front door hanging open. They couldn't find Sophie. Search dogs picked up her scent in the attic, but it stopped cold near the sealed wall. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no blood. Just the faint sound of a music box still playing when they arrived. Mark sat by her side, his face hollowed by sleeplessness. "They said there was no attic," he whispered, voice trembling. The inspector checked the plans. "There shouldn't even be space up there." Emily tried to speak, but her throat felt raw. "She's still in the house," she croaked. Mark shook his head, gripping her hand tighter. "The house isn't there anymore," he said. "It burned down last night." They said the fire started in the walls. The words didn't register at first, until she saw his hands shaking. He'd gone back to find Sophie. He'd seen something in those flames, something he refused to describe. When the doctors left, he finally whispered, before the roof collapsed. "I saw her." Sophie was standing with a woman. Both of them smiling. Then he buried his face in his hands. Days later, as Emily was discharged, a detective came to see her, a quiet man named Detective Harris, who had been working the missing persons case. He carried a thin folder, old and water-stained. "You're not the first," he said carefully, glancing over his shoulder. "That house, and 3 others like it. Built by the same developer in 1961. Every one of them had families disappear." He slid a paper toward her, blueprints marked Ashridge Development Project. Emily's heart stopped when she saw it. The design of the Jacobs home was identical to the house on Ashridge Lane, every wall, every window, every hidden space perfectly matched. "It's the same house," Harris said softly. "They just keep rebuilding it." That night, unable to sleep, Emily spread the blueprints across her kitchen table. There were markings along the foundation, circular symbols drawn in faded red ink, surrounding the words, "Bound to the Earth." Her fingers traced the lines, and as she did, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. Each blueprint was slightly different, yet every one had a hidden room, a sealed chamber connected to the others by underground tunnels. She followed the paths with her eyes until they converged at one spot in the center of the map, a location labeled, "The Route." The ink around it was darker, fresher, almost wet. A knock echoed at the door. 3 slow raps. Emily froze. Through the peephole, no one was there, only a damp envelope lying on the porch. Inside were photographs, recent ones. Her daughter, standing beside a burned house, holding the same music box. The image was blurry, but behind her stood a shadowed figure with long hair and hollow eyes. On the back of the photo, in smeared handwriting, was a single message: "You opened the wall. Now come find the others." The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. It fell in thin, steady sheets over the countryside as Emily's car wound down a forgotten rural road. Beside her sat Detective Harris, chain-smoking and scanning the map spread across his lap. "This is the area," he said, tapping a spot labeled Lot 0, Original Foundation. No record of construction, but the first developer, Elias Trent, listed it as a testing site before he died. Heart attack, supposedly. Emily barely listened. She was staring out at the trees, their soaked branches arching like ribs over the narrow road. The further they drove, the more the forest seemed to press in, swallowing the light. After an hour, they reached a rusted gate half buried in weeds. A faded sign leaned against it: "Ashridge Development, Keep Out." Harris forced it open, and they drove through until the car came to a stop before what looked like a half-finished basement, concrete walls jutting from the ground like tombstones. The roof was gone, and wild vines had grown through the cracks. Emily's breath caught when she saw the carvings on the foundation, the same circular symbols from the blueprints, only deeper, more deliberate. Someone had etched them into the stone decades ago. She ran her fingers across one, and it was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like living skin. They descended into the hollow structure, flashlights cutting through the damp dark. Old tools lay scattered across the floor, rusted beyond recognition. In one corner sat a cluster of wooden crates stamped Trent Construction, 1961. Harris pried one open and froze. Inside were dozens of black and white photographs, families standing proudly in front of their new homes, smiling. But each face was smudged, as if erased. The last photo in the pile made Emily's stomach twist. It showed a man, Elias Trent himself, standing beside a woman she recognized instantly, Emma Carver. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "The first binding is complete." Before Emily could speak, the ground shuddered. A deep rumble rolled through the foundation, followed by a sound like wind howling inside the stone itself. Harris swung his flashlight toward the stairs. Something was moving there, a blur of pale limbs, dragging itself forward. "Back to the car," he yelled, grabbing her arm. But before they reached the exit, a figure stepped from the shadows, a woman in a tattered blue dress, eyes black, hands outstretched. "Emma." Her voice came in a whisper that wasn't sound but vibration. "You're too late. The root is awake." Then the walls began to bleed. Thick, black water poured from the carvings, running down to form a pool that reflected not their faces, but hundreds of others, families, children, all staring up as if trapped beneath the surface. They barely escaped. As Emily slammed the car door, Harris looked back at the ruin collapsing in on itself. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he saw faces pressing out of the concrete, mouths open in silent screams before being swallowed again. Emily clutched the music box in her lap, shaking uncontrollably. When she opened it, the broken tune played again, but this time, another sound joined it. A faint voice, distant but clear, whispering from inside the melody, "You can't burn a root. It grows where you live." The Millers moved into their dream home on the first clear day after weeks of rain. It was a modern rebuild on the edge of town, pale wood siding, tall windows, and a yard that sloped gently into a patch of forest. The real estate company called it the Ashridge Estate, part of a revival project to bring life back to abandoned lots. To Rachel Miller, a teacher, and her husband Tom, it was perfect, quiet, affordable, and close enough to the city for their morning commute. The agent, a polite man in a gray suit, had mentioned something about foundational history, but waved it off as construction jargon. When the family arrived, their 6-year-old son, Ethan, ran to the backyard shouting, "There's someone already here." Rachel laughed, until she saw the footprints in the soft mud. Bare, small, and leading straight to the edge of the trees. That night, as rain returned in a soft mist, Rachel heard tapping in the walls, faint but deliberate. She followed the sound through the hallway until she reached the basement door. When she opened it, a rush of cold air hit her face, smelling of earth and stagnant water. The basement was unfinished, but there was something new, a patch of darker concrete in the center of the floor, smooth and circular. Someone had poured fresh cement recently. As she stepped closer, Ethan's voice called from the stairs, sleepy and quiet. "Mom," he said, rubbing his eyes, "the people downstairs want to talk to you." The words chilled her more than the air ever could. The next morning, she noticed small cracks forming across that same patch of concrete. She asked Tom about it, but he shrugged. New foundation, old soil. Probably settling. Still, that night she dreamed of the cracks widening, forming symbols she didn't understand. Circles. Roots. Faces. When she woke, she found Ethan sitting cross-legged by the basement door, humming softly to himself. "Who taught you that song?" she asked, recognizing the eerie melody from the tune Emily's music box once played. "The lady did," he said. "The one who lives under the floor." Rachel's blood ran cold. She asked him what the lady looked like. He smiled faintly and said, "She looks like you, Mommy. But her eyes don't move." Tom tried to fill the cracks with sealant, but by morning, the patch was damp again. Water seeped through from below, black and thick as tar. He pressed a towel over it. The towel came back with dark handprints. That night, as thunder rolled outside, they heard something pounding from beneath the floorboards, in slow, rhythmic bursts. The sound of fists, or maybe hearts. When Rachel finally gathered the courage to open the basement door again, she froze. The cracks had widened into an open circle, and from its center rose a faint orange light. Ethan stood beside it, eyes wide, whispering to someone only he could see. "They're almost done building," he said softly. She said, "The fourth house is next." The light pulsed once, then vanished. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. When Tom ran to grab his son, he found only the music box lying on the ground, its melody faint and broken. On the walls of the basement, words had begun to appear in dripping black strokes: "4 built, 1 remains." And somewhere deep beneath the house, something moved, a shifting mass, alive, stretching upward toward the foundation that connected them all. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled like it, soil, ash, and iron. Emily stood outside what was left of the old county records building, its roof caved in, the floor half flooded. Detective Harris was already inside, flashlight in hand, rummaging through warped filing cabinets. "We're running out of places to look," he muttered. "Every file about Ashridge development is either missing or burned." Emily didn't answer, her gaze was fixed on the muddy floor where faint prints led toward the basement stairs. Small prints. Bare feet. Just like Sophie's had been that night. "What if it's not just the houses," she said quietly. "What if it's the land itself that's remembering what we've done to it?" Downstairs, the walls were lined with boxes marked 1961, Trent Foundation. Inside were property ledgers, survey maps, and correspondence between Elias Trent and local officials. But something else caught Harris's eye, a ledger page filled not with words, but symbols, circles, crosses, and branching lines that resembled roots. At the bottom of the page, Trent had written one sentence in thick black ink: "To contain what crawls beneath, build in fours." Harris swallowed hard. "Contain," he repeated. "Not summon. Not create. Contain." Emily's eyes widened. So the houses weren't cursed, they were cages. As they pieced it together, a low hum began to fill the basement. It came from the earth itself, vibrating through the concrete. The light above them flickered once, twice, then died. In the dark, Harris's radio crackled with static before a faint voice bled through. "Ridge Lane. Foundation breach, family missing." He froze. "That's this morning's date," he whispered. The static grew louder, then shifted to a child's voice singing the familiar tune of the music box. Emily's hands trembled. "It's happening again," she said. "They rebuilt another one." When they surfaced, dawn was breaking. Mud clung to their boots as they drove toward the outskirts of town, to the new development Emily had seen on the blueprints. When they arrived, her stomach turned cold. She recognized the design instantly. It was the Miller's house. The same shape, the same porch, the same circular basement mark that had once been beneath her own home. Only this one was still standing, lights on, curtains drawn, and a car in the driveway. "Someone's living there," Harris said. "Already?" Emily shook her head. "Not for long." They approached slowly, flashlights cutting through the mist. But as they neared the front door, the earth under their feet shuddered. A deep cracking sound echoed through the foundation. The ground split slightly between them, and through the gap came a faint orange glow, like something alive just beneath the soil, pulsing in rhythm with their hearts. Then came the voice, soft, calm, and layered, rising from the ground itself. "Four built, one remains. The last house is yours." The earth sealed itself again, as if nothing had happened. But in the silence that followed, Emily realized the truth: the root wasn't just under the houses. It had already spread, through the foundations, through the town, and through her. The house was still, unnaturally so. Even the air around it felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Emily stood by the front steps, rain-soaked and trembling, while Harris checked the perimeter. The windows were dark now, though a faint humming could be heard from within, the same low, rhythmic sound they'd heard in the record's basement. "No signs of forced entry," Harris murmured. "But someone's in there." Emily didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the doorframe, where she could see faint carvings just beneath the fresh paint, the same root-like sigils that had haunted her walls years ago. Only this time, they pulsed faintly, alive, feeding on something beneath. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of varnish and wet plaster. The living room was pristine, untouched furniture, flowers on the table, not a speck of dust. But it felt wrong. Too clean. Too still. Emily moved deeper in, her flashlight beam trembling over the walls. Everywhere she looked, the same repeating shape, branching lines forming circles that spiraled inward. "It's not decoration," she whispered. "It's containment. They're trying to hold it in again." Harris crouched by the floor vent, where a faint warmth seeped upward. "Then whatever's down there isn't staying put." The humming deepened, rising into a sound that was almost a voice. Then, from upstairs, came the creak of a single footstep. Harris motioned for Emily to stay behind him and drew his sidearm. They climbed the stairs, step by step, until they reached the landing. The light flickered on, and there, at the end of the hall, stood a little girl in a white nightgown. Her eyes were completely black, her mouth moving as if she were whispering something over and over. Harris froze. "Emily," he said quietly, "she's not," but before he could finish, the girl turned, and every door in the hallway slammed shut simultaneously. The walls seemed to breathe. And from behind the closed doors came voices, crying, screaming, begging, the echo of every family that had ever lived in a house like this one. Emily backed away, heart hammering. "This house isn't new," she said suddenly. "It's built on the same foundation. They just rebuild it over and over." She ran to the staircase and shouted down toward the basement door. "That's what it wants. The houses aren't cages, they're gateways." The floorboards cracked beneath her feet, and the temperature plummeted. A massive shudder tore through the house, throwing both of them off balance. The humming became a roar. In the chaos, Emily saw the girl at the end of the hall dissolve, her body breaking apart into ash and dust that drifted upward, forming a spiral that led straight through the ceiling. They stumbled into the basement as the structure began to collapse around them. Below, the circular mark glowed red-hot, roots snaking outward through the dirt walls like veins. In the center of the mark was a pit, deep, breathing, pulsing with light. Harris looked at it, horror dawning. "It's not a curse," he said. "It's a heart. The land is alive." Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling. "No," she said. "It's not alive. It's remembering us. Every foundation, every wall, it's been keeping our ghosts." The pit shuddered, and from its depths came a chorus of human voices whispering her name. "Emily." The floor began to cave in, and the light surged upward in a blinding flash. Emily felt herself being pulled toward the pit, the air screaming around her. Harris grabbed her arm, anchoring her as debris rained from above. "We have to seal it," she shouted. "The symbols, on the walls." Harris turned, using his flashlight to find the carvings. With trembling hands, he traced the sigils, completing the circle with the black ink from his pen. As he did, the light dimmed, the roar faded, and the ground began to settle. The house fell silent again. But when Emily opened her eyes, Harris was gone, only his flashlight lay by the edge of the pit, its beam flickering weakly against the dirt. The silence after the collapse was suffocating. Dust floated in the air like snow, and the faint red glow from the pit had faded to a dull ember. Emily crouched beside the circle, coughing, eyes watering. "Harris?" Her voice cracked in the quiet. No answer. She grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the pit, heart sinking as the beam revealed only shifting dirt. He was gone. Swallowed whole. For a long time, she didn't move. The hum was gone, the house still, and yet, in the walls, she could still feel the faint heartbeat of the ground. It wasn't over. Not yet. When she finally staggered outside, dawn was just breaking. The new development stretched out in front of her, dozens of identical houses in neat rows, all with freshly poured foundations. On every lot, survey markers were arranged in circles. "4 built, 1 remains," she whispered, remembering Trent's words. The town was rebuilding faster than ever, unaware that every new foundation opened another wound in the earth. She realized then that the land wasn't just remembering, it was learning. Adapting. It had taken Harris. It would take everyone else soon. Determined, Emily drove straight to the old record site. She tore through what remained of the archives until she found it, Trent's original blueprints, yellowed and half-burned. Beneath the sketches of homes were handwritten notes, containment degrades after each reconstruction. At the bottom, a final scrawl in ink darker than the rest: if one cage breaks, burn the others before they wake. Emily's hands trembled as she read it. To stop the thing under Ashridge, she'd have to destroy all the remaining homes, the same homes families were already moving into. Her phone buzzed then. Unknown number. She answered with shaking fingers. Silence. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and wrong, "Emily, come home." It was Harris's voice, echoing, distorted, calling from beneath the static. That night, she returned to the site with a can of gasoline and a box of matches. The houses stood quiet, perfect silhouettes against the moonlight. She walked to the newest one, the house that had replaced hers, and stepped onto the porch. Inside, the air smelled like her old life. The same wooden floors. The same photos on the walls. A replica down to the smallest detail. Her hand trembled as she struck the match, flame trembling in the still air. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You wanted to be remembered. Now you will be." She dropped the match, and the fire caught fast, racing across the walls, devouring the home in minutes. The screams came again, not from the fire, but from beneath it, hundreds of voices howling in fury and release. When dawn broke again, only ashes remained. The development site was a blackened scar on the landscape, the air thick with smoke. Fire crews arrived to find a single figure standing amid the ruins, Emily, silent, staring at the ground. They said she looked calm. Almost peaceful. But when one of them touched her shoulder, she turned, and her eyes reflected something deep and shifting, the faint glow of roots pulsing beneath the soil. That night, from the hills beyond the town, witnesses claimed to see faint orange veins spreading through the earth, tracing the old property lines. The root wasn't gone. It had only changed shape. And somewhere beneath the ashes, a single heartbeat continued, steady, patient, waiting for the next house to rise.